Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to Hope United Church. Welcome to our public discussion on the radical advocacy of Prince Lourenco da Silva Mendonça of Mendonca in the 17th century, the 1684 International Court case for the abolition of slavery before the Vatican, and the implications for reparations. And this afternoon's discussion is sponsored by the Jamaica Council of Churches, that's the JCC, and the Church's Reparations Action Forum, CRAF. I'm Anna Perkins, and I'm your moderator for this afternoon. I want to say a very, very warm welcome. I think literally warm. I'm not the only one. Many of us in here are feeling warm, but warm welcome to everyone here. And we certainly want to warmly welcome those joining us online on YouTube. We're thanking Hope United Church for hosting the discussion and Mr. Mark L. Virgo for the music and all the other things that go with getting this thing out on the web. There's some special invited guests that we have with us this afternoon, and I'd like to begin by recognizing them. And these are the ones that I'm aware of and the one that I've been able to identify. So we have to, right up front, apologize if we neglect to recognize you. So I certainly want to start off by recognizing Bishop Christine Gooden Benguche, and she's the president of the Jamaica Council of Churches. I also recognize with us Right Reverend Garth Minot, and he's the Suffragan Bishop of Kingston. Recognizing too all the various heads of denominations that might be present with us and all the priests, pastors, and ministers of the various churches across Kingston that are here. We have some distinguished members of the judiciary with us as well. I'm recognizing Mr. Patrick Brooks, Mr. Justice Patrick Brooks, the retired president of our Court of Appeals. Mr. Justice Charles Pennycook is also here with us. And while not there yet, but we're going to recognize Mr. Jeremy Taylor, Senior DPP, here with us as well. I'm recognizing Reverend Dr. Stephen Jennings, who is the head of CRAF, and he's the pastor of the Mona Baptist Church up the road. Recognizing our own retired Judge Patrick Robinson. Professor Emeritus Rupert Lewis. I'm professor in her own right as well. Mrs. Lewis, Prof. First name just went right out of my head. Distinguished presenters, of course, were here with us this afternoon. Professor Jose Lingna Nafafe, and he's Associate Professor of African and Atlantic History at the University of Bristol, and I'll tell you a little bit more about Prof when I'm introducing him later on. Dr. Mamadou Hebe, and Mamadou is a former legal advisor to the President of the International Court of Justice and an Associate Professor of International Law, one of our keynote presenters, and further introductions to come in a short while. We have with us Professor Emerita Vereen Shepherd, where's Prof? Right over here. And she's a Professor of History and Gender Studies, member of the UN Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination, and many people remember her as a former host of Talking History on Nationwide 90 FM. Prof. Ann Bailey, she's a professor of history at Binghamton University, and she's a member of CRAF, and she'll be speaking with us as well today. There's also with us Reverend Deacon Peter Espute, and Peter is Dean of Studies at St. Michael's College, which is an institute of the Roman Catholic Archdiocese of Kingston. So that's what I have in front of me as those for whom we must be specially recognizing persons. I also think it would be important to say hi and a very, very special welcome to Professor Tracy Robinson and the members, the participants who joined her, and I was happy to be a part of the Mona Law Symposium on Colonial Legacies in Public and Private Law. It's very, very special welcome to you all. Welcome, Mom. Good to see you. Good to have you. We're going to take protocols as having been recognized. So we're going to work with time and everything, and my job is to move things along as swiftly as possible, but also allow you to learn a lot and to enjoy our time together. So I've given you the protocols, all the people who need to be recognized. You don't need to repeat the names when you come up to give your remarks or to give your greetings. And the same thing goes for our distinguished lecturers as well, all right? So I've done the heavy lifting. So we'd like to begin by invoking God's presence. And at this point, I'm inviting Reverend Dr. Stephen Jennings to lead us in the opening prayer.
Thank you, Professor Perkins. Let us pray. Almighty God, God of liberation and freedom, the God who opposes inequity and injustice, we give you thanks for today and for the mission of today. We thank you for our ancestors who fought for freedom, justice, and for human dignity. And we give you thanks that today we can help to uncover the efforts of one of them. We thank you for scholars, for Dr. Nafafi and Dr. Hebe, who have done this bit of research and who have committed themselves to uncovering this important aspect of history. We thank you for the Jamaica Council of Churches in its week of celebrations and for the Churches Reparation Action Forum for their collaboration and commitment to ensuring that revelation of this sort comes to us in the Caribbean. Today, we ask for your continued inspiration, that by your Holy Spirit, you might allow this occasion to become an opportunity for revealing truth, for providing inspiration, for helping to bring about conviction, and to give direction as to how we should proceed and live our lives for flourishing freedom. Bless every aspect, therefore, of these proceedings, and we ask that you'll give us guidance, give us civility, and give us a sense of justice. We give you thanks for all of this and more. In your name we pray. Amen.
Thanks, Rev. We'd like to now invite Bishop Gooden Benguche, the president of the Jamaica Council of Churches, to bring us a word of welcome. And I'm always happy to be able to say bishop and be referring to a lady. Bishop, please join us.
Thank you, moderator, Professor Anna Perkins. And the pleasure is mine. I think I have the best task, and that is to extend a very warm welcome in addition to what was received or shared by our moderator this evening. And indeed, to our special guest and to our distinguished ladies and gentlemen, because as I look around in the audience, I believe that we only have distinguished ladies and gentlemen here, Professor, with us this evening. And we are truly grateful to God for the minds that are here this evening. And so the Jamaica Council of Churches is pleased to extend welcome to you in collaboration, of course, with CRAF, that is headed by Reverend Dr. Stephen Jennings. And we are really pleased that we can have these minds, sir, as the presentation is made, and afterwards to have the engagement that will take place in the discussion. We have a wide variety of persons from the justice system, persons from the church, persons from the community, and the various stakeholders that we have, not just dealing with issues related to reparations, but where do we go from here as we continue to wrestle with this topic of reparations that we have been dealing with quite some time. So welcome, and truly as the presentations are made, we ask that you will make your notes and that at the end you will be able to ask questions, because I know we are already expecting great things, we are anticipating, and I know we should not be disappointed. So let me again say welcome, and we await the word that you both will share with us, my brothers. Thank you so much, everybody.
Thank you very much, my sister Bishop. Now I'm going to ask Justice Patrick Robinson to say some brief words to us. Justice is actually going to sit and present, so we're going to get this mic live.
The seat is a bit low, but I want to assure you that I'm not replacing the chairperson. I'm merely sitting here. Ladies and gentlemen, his was a voice that would have been lost to history, but for the groundbreaking research of Dr. Jose Lingnan Nafafe of Guinea-Bissau and Bristol University in the United Kingdom. In his book, published by Cambridge University Press in 2022 and entitled Lourenco da Silva Mendonça and the Black Abolitionist Movement in the 17th Century, Dr. Nafafe unearths material showing the case that Mendonça presented at the Vatican in 1684 for the abolition of transatlantic chattel slavery. And this was long before the English abolitionists. After making contact with Dr. Nafafe in August of 2024, it did not take long for me to decide that this gentleman should come to Jamaica to tell us the story of Mendonça. I wanted Jamaica, the Caribbean, and indeed the world to share the pride that I felt in the achievement of this early abolitionist who succeeded in persuading the Vatican that transatlantic chattel slavery was unlawful. And that is why I asked the Jamaica Council of Churches to sponsor tonight's function, and I want to express my gratitude to the council. I also express my gratitude to Reverend Samuels for allowing us to use this church. Ladies and gentlemen, Mendonça is indeed, in every respect, the godfather of the abolitionist movement. Now, spare a thought for the second speaker. That's Dr. Mamadou Hebi, the legal advisor to the president of the International Court of Justice when I served as a member there. And he now lectures in international law at the Grotius Institute for International Legal Studies at the University of Leiden in the Netherlands. And you have to think kindly of Mamadou. He only recently discovered that he did not have a visa to enter Jamaica. And that presented us with many problems. But to cut a long story short, after toing and froing, Mamadou got the visa on arrival in Jamaica. So I was going to ask you to give a hand, because if you notice, we have 2 West Africans here, one from Guinea-Bissau and one from Burkina Faso. And the statistic stares us in the face. Over 90% of the population of this country descended from West Africa. So it is very appropriate that we have our West African cousins to tell us this wonderful story about Mendonça. So please give a hand to both of them and listen carefully to the presentation. Thank you.
Justice, thank you very much. So you did get a bit of an introduction to Jose, and you certainly did get a little bit from Mamadou as well, but perhaps we need to give a little bit more about Mamadou and Jose. But just to say that I got introduced to Lourenco da Silva Mendonça just about a year or so ago, because I was asked to do a review for the Journal of Moral Theology for a book called All Oppressions Shall Cease by a Jesuit priest, a Catholic. And the subtitle of the book was, I'll tell you because it's meaningful to me. So the title was All Oppression Shall Cease, A History of Slavery, Abolition, and the Catholic Church, by a Jesuit priest, a 2024 publication, I think it was. It was a very, very painful read for me, and I came away from it in a certain way very angry, because a lot of what I'd learned, for example, about some of the Catholic saints, turned out that they weren't as saintly as we had been led to believe. You know, so I think of Peter Claver, for example, and learned that he was a slaveholder, and how he treated the enslaved people, and the way we tell the story today, he went and greeted the enslaved people and took care of them. So that was a very eye-opening read for me, as painful as it was. But then I also encountered Lourenco. So there are like probably 5 pages or so in there. And then reading how Kellerman, using his sources, including sources that you have used in your own work, Gray and so on, presented a picture that was totally different when I read your work. And so I was over the moon, because the story that you're telling is our story, and they're not telling the story for us. And it's not a truncated story, Prof. So I assure you, you're going to have your eyes opened wide this evening when you listen to what Professor Nafafe has to say to you. So who is Professor Nafafe, and why is he, apart from being our cousin from West Africa, a good person to be speaking with us this afternoon? Well, I'll tell you a little bit more about him. In 2016, he was awarded a Leverhulme Research Fellowship to undertake archival research for the project Freedom and Lusophone African Diaspora in the Atlantic. He's the co-investigator for an ERC Advanced Grant on modern marronage, the pursuit and practice of freedom in the contemporary world. And he's working alongside Professor Davidson at the University of Bristol. And he's doing work too on the Quilombos in Brazil, how they were in the past and how they currently are. And he may well say something a little bit about those as well, because the Quilombos, for those of you who don't know, right, Prof, are the communities of the Africans who ran away from enslavement. He was nominated for the BME Power List in 2018, so he was recognized as one of Bristol's most influential BME people for having advanced the history on resistance to enslavement through groundbreaking research which African Voices Forum shared on the Africa Eye Film Festival of 2017. And there's so much more that we could say about him. He's currently working on his third monograph, which is entitled Beyond Wilberforce's Experiment in Abolitionism, the Yellow Fever Epidemic, Unfree Labor, Wages, and the Market, 1792 to 1850. And maybe some of that will be exposed in our conversation later on. A quick introduction for Mamadou, who I've gotten to know just a day or two and think of as a younger brother. Mamadou, I'm looking at a picture here. If I didn't see you, I wouldn't recognize you because this man looked really slick and very westernized, right? But Associate Professor of International Law at the Grotius Center for International Legal Studies at Leiden University. He holds a PhD summa cum laude, and there's a French version of it I'm not going to try to pronounce, some avec la félicitations, something. And he has a diploma of advanced studies in international relations with a specialization in international law from the Graduate Institute of International and Development Studies. He also graduated from Harvard Law School and the Geneva Academy of International Humanitarian Law and Human Rights, and he's a recipient of the diplomas of the Hague Academy of International Law and the International Institute of Human Rights. And importantly, he was a special assistant to the president of the International Court of Justice, and he's a member of the New York Bar. That's a whole lot of heavy lifting, especially as we know what's going on in constitutional and legal affairs in the US right now. So please join me in welcoming Professor Nafafe for our keynote.
Good evening or good afternoon. Shall we put this up? Shall we put this up just slightly? Yeah. Can you hear me now? Oh, thank you. Yeah, before I start, I would like to extend my deepest heartfelt gratitude to Judge Patrick Robinson for bringing me here. I would also like to thank Professor Tracy Robinson for inviting me to be part of the workshop at Mona University. I would like to thank Jamaican Council of Churches and the Churches Reparation Action Forum for sponsoring my way of coming to Kingston to talk to you. My thanks to my colleagues here present, Professor Mamadou, and thanks to Professor Ann Perkins for that beautiful introduction, and thanks to the colleagues who come from the conference to be here to listen to me. I hope we will be having a very interesting discussion tonight that might be very helpful for many other things that we are thinking about. My thanks to go to Cam Howard, who had to come from United States of America to be here to listen to what we have to say here this afternoon. Okay, let's now turn back to what brought me to Jamaica, which is about Lourenco da Silva Mendonça. This is the book. If you haven't seen it, I'm going to pass it around, have a look at it, but at the end, please let me have the copy back.
I'll pass it to you.
Thank you. As a way of introduction, on the 6th of March, 1684, Lourenco da Silva Mendonça from the Kingdom of Congo in the Indies arrived in Rome, quote, to take up an important role for black peoples, end of quote. That role was to bring criminal Kafunda case in the Kimbundu language before the Vatican court, accusing the states involved in the Atlantic slave trade for committing crimes against African people. And these countries that Mendonça had in mind were Spain, Italy, Portugal, and the Curia, what today is called the Vatican, of committing crime against enslaved Africans that today would undoubtedly constitute crimes against humanity. This court case details the tyrannical sale of human beings, quote, the diabolical abuse of this kind of slavery which they committed against any divine or human law, end of quote. Mendonça, as we just heard, was a member of the Pungandongo royal family, rulers of Pedras in the Portuguese town of Pungandongo, situated in what is now modern-day Angola. He carried with him the hopes of the enslaved Africans and the other oppressed groups in what was a remarkable moment that I would argue challenges the established interpretation of the history of slavery. In the Anglophone literature, debate on enslaved African experiences and the abolition of the Atlantic's history has largely, I would argue here, been dominated by the US historian, whose work is often geographically focused on the US, the Caribbean, Anglophone Africa, and temporarily limited to the 18th and 19th century. Much less attention has been paid to the Lusophone Africa, countries colonized by the Portuguese, Brazil, Portugal, Spain, and Vatican, which leaves a huge gap in knowledge on slavery and abolition. In particular, the almost exclusive focus on the 18th and 19th century Euro-American debates on the abolition overlooked the earlier abolition debate that took place in the Lusophone Atlantic in the 17th century. Mendonça's writing on freedom are distinguished by their holistic engagement with the themes of life, death, abolition, and reparations. Researching Mendonça's court case help us gain a deeper understanding of transatlantic slave trade, showing Africa the slave trade, abolition, and reparation in a complete new light. Legal, moral, and ethical, and political debate on the abolition of slavery has traditionally been understood to have been initiated by Europeans in the 18th centuries. Figures such as Thomas Braxton, Thomas Claston, Granville Sharp, David Livingstone, and William Wilberforce. To the extent that the Africans are recognized as having played any role in ending slavery, especially in the 17th century, their efforts are typically confined to sporadic, impulsive cases of resistance involving shipboard revolt, maroon community, individual fugitive slaves, and household revolt. Studies of these cases has never gone beyond the obvious economic disruption caused by the enslaved people, resulting to poisoning, murder, and attack on plantations and their masters' household properties. Even those enslaved Africans, such as Alaura Aquino, Otoba Kokuano, who gained their freedom through sheer endeavor and subsequently argued in the strongest term for the abolition of slavery in the 18th and 19th century, were seen as limited in scope, without international impact, and reliant on their European counterparts. Curiously, to date, no historian of slavery of West Central Africa, Africanist, or Atlanticist have researched the Black Atlantic abolition movement in the 17th century. And those who have attempted to engage with such debate often conclude that any action driven by African was a localized endeavor. No historian has yet provided an in-depth study of highly organized, international-scale legal court case for liberation and abolition spearheaded by Lourenco da Silva Mendonça, or, as Mendonça called it, the complaints about justice. In this paper, I examine in detail how Mendonça and the historical actors with whom he was involved, such as Black Christians from confraternities in Angola, Brazil, Caribbean, Portugal, and Spain, argued for complete abolition of Atlantic slave trade well before Wilberforce and his generations of abolitionists. I will examine Mendonça's life. Second, I will look at his education. Third, I will look at his appointment and presentation. And fourth, I will examine the verdict, 11 questions and answers, as a new research providing in-depth analysis of Mendonça's abolition movement. It revealed for the first time how local debates were initiated not by Europeans, but by Africans. For him, slavery was indeed a crime according to 4 principles of law known to human society: natural, human, divine, and civil. Let's look at his life. Prince Lourenco Mendonça da Silva, as we just seen, was born in the Kingdom of Pedras of Punguandongo in 1649 in Angola. His place of death remains unknown. His birth coincided with Portugal tightening up its grips on the slave trade in West Central Africa. This trade's brutal effect defined his earlier childhood and adulthood. Mendonça's grandfather, King Philip Harry I, was first Angolan allied to the King of Portugal after being conquered. Angola was named after the title of its king, which was Angola. Harry I had to fight wars alongside Portuguese troops against other Angolans, in which 2 of his sons, including Mendonça's father, Inácio da Silva, and Francisco, heir to the throne, died. For 38 years, Harry I was compelled to provide the Portuguese crown a tax of 100 enslaved persons per year, as a tax known baculamento in the Kimbundu language of Angola, meaning tax. He was forced to provide 3,800 enslaved people to the crown, just one man alone. His son, Harry II, Mendonça's uncle, a graduate from Jesuit College of Angola, became a king in 1664 after Harry I's passing. Harry II refused to provide 100 enslaved persons per year, leading to the Portuguese crown declaring war on him and his kingdom in 1671. Harry II was captured and killed. His head was brought to Portugal. Mendonça, along with his uncles, aunts, brothers, protested against the Portuguese and refused to provide as tax enslaved African or enslaved Angolan people to the Portuguese crown. In the 16th and 17th century, Portugal was in the far front of the maritime empires of the Atlantic slave trade. In 1585, Luanda, modern-day Angolan capital, was established as a port south of Congo Kingdom in the Punguandongo Kingdom, serving this very trade. Lourenco da Silva Mendonça took his father's surname to become Lourenco da Silva y Mendonça, E here being the Portuguese standing for and in English. After the destruction of Pungandongo in 1671, Mendonça with his uncles and aunts, brothers, were exiled to the city of Salvador in Brazil. In 1673, Mendonça was then taken to Rio de Janeiro, where he lived for possibly 6 months. After spending 2 years in Brazil, he was sent to Portugal in August 1673. Let us now examine his education, his appointment as an international lawyer. In Portugal, by the order of the Portuguese crown, Mendonça studied numbers of subjects, including 4 years at the convent of Vilar de Flores, including law, by the way. His 3 brothers were sent to other monasteries too, but not to the same monastery as him. They were sent to Basto, Moreira, and Celcedas. By the 1680s, Mendonça was elected as an international lawyer by the King of Spain, Carlos II, for Black Christian group or the confraternities across Africa, Portugal, Brazil, the Americas, Asia, and Europe. On the 23rd of September, 1682, he was elected again at the Royal Court of Madrid, Toledo, and therefore was allowed to practice, quote, throughout the whole of Christendom, in any kingdom or dominion, and using the economic and political right which is conferred to him, end of quote. To clarify, he was appointed in 1682 by Carlos II. His appointment was supported by following 4 officials: Gaspar de Costa Mesquita, notary of the Curia in Portugal; Luis Manuel Fernandez Portacarrero de Guzman, Spain, Archbishop of Toledo; Don Lourenco del Real, Cachua from Peru, Master of Music of the Royal Court of Madrid, Spain; and Jacinto Rosio Monzio, Curio Notary in Spain. In 1684, Lourenco, now an international lawyer for Black Christians, appeared before the Vatican and presented a court case to Pope Innocent XI. The case petitioned the Vatican, Portugal, Spain, Italy to stop enslaving African people. He demanded abolition not only for African, but also for New Christian and Native Americans in the Atlantic world. Mesquita's letters of recommendation confirmed his appointment as an attorney in Lisbon for the Confraternity of Our Lady of Rosary of Black men. Quote, I confirm that Lourenco da Silva Mendonça, a padroman, a natural of this Kingdom of Portugal, is now working in the city of Lisbon, end of quote. Mesquita's letters of recommendation indicates that Mendonça has already taken a position of attorney soon after his arrival in Lisbon, where he stayed until the 15th of February, 1681, when he departed for the Royal Court of Madrid, Toledo. He was appointed to the position of attorney in Lisbon after he left Vilar de Frades in around 1678 to 1679. He was elected a member of Mesa, or the Board of Guardian of the Confraternities of Our Lady of the Rosary of Black Men. Mesquita's letters shows that Mendonça was already on duty in Lisbon as an attorney for Black Christian in Portugal, Brazil, Castile, prior to 1681. His years in Lisbon provided Mendonça with expertise and skills to take his ideas to Rome. In itself, membership of the Confraternity of the Rosary of Our Lady of Black Men gave him the legal platform for doing what he was able to do at the time, regardless of his personal status as a member of the board of Mesa. He may have been a political prisoner, But there was no legal framework to prevent him from being part of the confraternity, and he was not a slave. In other words, the confraternity was the perfect fit for him as he honed his argument regarding freedom. Mendonça sought support from within the confraternities, particularly from the members of the Mesa, such as Lourenco del Real and Mesquita, who represented the tradition of the Council of Trent, now in modern Italy, from which the Constitution emerged. There may have been other voices from Portugal that condemned slavery, but they did not do so from the universal point of view of the liberation that Mendonça sought for the enslaved African in Brazil, Africa, Portugal, the Americas, Spain, and the native indigenous Brazilian, as well as the New Christian. By applying the legal provision of the Confraternity Constitution, Mendonça would set up himself for success where others before him failed. He used the constitutional right of black brotherhood within the legal framework of the time. Legally, he was not demanding anything new from the Western Christendom. He simply deployed the existing legal framework to liberate enslaved Africans. His role as an attorney enabled him to fight for the liberation of the confraternity's member. I just now wanted to show the first picture, the other one that you already shown. The one with the journey. Yeah, we can see there his journey as he moved along from Pungandongo to Brazil. Mendonça's journey from Pungandongo to Salvador, Rio de Janeiro, Braga in Portugal, Toledo in Madrid, and the Vatican provided him with collegial background and support to address the suffering of those whose liberty had been denied. Following Mendonça's presentation at the Vatican, Portugal and Spain made a concerted effort to abolish slavery in the 17th century. Let us now take a closer look at his presentation delivered at the Vatican. He addressed Pope Innocent XI as the supreme judge of Christendom, focusing on key themes that resonate deeply with the enslaved African and the suffering of the oppressed people in the Atlantic world. He questioned the very human values upheld by Catholic Church, especially the Vatican, which were denied to the African. His empowered presentation, rooted in the suffering of the African people, not only provided information to Pope Innocent XI, but also, without a shadow of doubt, convinced the particular body that presided over the case he presented. His presentation. The Vatican was a leading court in the Catholic world. In the 15th and 16th century, the Vatican had issued series of papal bulls permitting the enslavement of the African, implying it also had the judicial authority to ban slavery. His argument for abolition included non-Iberian empires in Africa, the Americas, Europe, and enabled him to take his criminal court case to the Supreme Court of Christendom in an attempt to overturn Pope Nicholas V's bull, which was written in 1452 and also repeated in 1455, which was the foundation of perpetual Atlantic slavery. He, Mendonça, went to Rome to persuade Pope Innocent XI to take action and support the enslaved people's right for judicial oversight for their liberation. For Mendonça, full judicial scrutiny of the papal bulls that promoted slavery was necessary to ensure that those involved in the transatlantic slave trade fulfill their Christian obligations. Mendonça carried a message of death to the Vatican. Death for the enslaved African was not a question of if, but when. The death that Mendonça was talking about was not what one would view as a necessary component of a human being or a moral creature. That is, this was not death by natural causes, but rather death that was imposed on the enslaved Africans for being marked as slaves, as someone else's property. In his court case in the Vatican, Mendonça made it clear that the enslaved Africans in Brazil and elsewhere were living between the threat of violence and the loss of hope of a proper human existence. Their lives were swept away by violence, by suicide, which they often carried out as a way to end their suffering. He encapsulated their suffering in the Latin dictum, mors certa est, which translated means, quote, death is certain. I don't know now, we can go to that. So yeah, that is the picture I wanted for you to see. Death is certain. It was an inscription that featured on the coat of arms of the letter of recommendation that Papal Nuncio in Portugal, Gaspar de Mesquita, gave him. And this can still be found on the top of the Propaganda Fide building today in the Vatican. The significance of the phrase, quote, death is certain, is telling, because it sums up Mendonça's claim about violence committed against enslaved Africans. The complete phrase is, quote, death is certain, it's ours, is not, end of quote. That is the complete phrase in Latin. By removing the Latin phrase, which means it's our is not certain, Mendonça was challenging the deep-seated human fear of death, which was the daily companion of the enslaved Africans, the new Christian, and the indigenous Americans. On his coat of arms, Mendonça included a scale of justice, which for many people around the world would represent order and fairness. I don't know whether you can see at the top. What we attempted to blow up is the scale of justice. Mendonça's uses of scale of justice would have reminded Pope Innocent XI of his responsibility for justice, which was being denied to the Africans, the indigenous Americans, and the new Christian, even though they were part of Christendom. Firstly, when Mendonça presented his case, he argued that slavery contravened human law. That is law of the land that laid down by a particular group of people. Human law, too, is derived from human nature. It is a law that human makes to organize their society. Human law are general principle of law applicable to all human society. What Anthony Liska called, quote, a mutual forbearance and respect, end of quote. Secondly, Mendonça argued that slavery was against natural law. According to Thomas Aquinas, natural law derived from the creation itself, and the idea that God, the Creator, wants all human beings to have good things or basic goods. Natural law implies that all human beings are free. Thirdly, Mendonça contended that slavery had been practiced against divine law or God's law, in this case as expressed through the church or canon law, jus canoni, which entails a conjugation of relationships that preserve the dignity of all human beings. Fourthly, Mendonça argued that slavery was incompatible with civil law. Civil law stated explicitly, and it is clear and known to everyone. It is based on codes, for example, legislation on human rights. Civil law gives individual permission for most action, but one's action to act is limited. One must act responsibly. For Mendonça, the sellers, the buyers, and the lawgivers were irresponsible and lacking in their duty of care towards the Africans. Mendonça's court case in the Vatican revealed the truth about Atlantic slavery and its injustices as endorsed by the Vatican bulls and implemented by the Italian and Luso-Hispanic governing authority and their priests, merchants, buyers, and sellers in Africa, the Americas, and Europe. The Vatican was acting in contravention of laws that it was meant to uphold, and thus implicated in the crime against enslaved Africans in the Atlantic region. The Pope was to be considered guilty of the same crime as the merchant, governors, and ship captains in the Atlantic world, as well as in the New World. Ladies and gentlemen, I'll now turn to the new evidence that I was alerted to after the publication of my book, which I'm now seeing there, which is a verdict consisting of 11 questions and answers. The verdict of 11 questions and answers, they are not part of my book. They represent new research finding that emerged after its publication. There was an online discussion in a historical forum. One of the participants in that forum emailed me, pointing out these documents, which she believed could help me in my work. However, she did not know, or she did not realize that these documents were related to the case Mendonça presented to the Vatican. After I received this email that she sent me, I had a long telephone conversation with her. After that conversation, I visited the Archivio del Dicastero per la Dottrina della Fede, also known as the Holy Office Archive, located in the Vatican City. I found the document. I request that they be digitized, and you now have one of them in front of you. What you will see on the slide is the digitized copy of the 11 questions and answers that were presented to the Vatican and the answer given by the Vatican. So these were the law as I was presenting what Mendonça presented. So this, yeah, could you go back just one slide more? Yeah, this is the verdict in Latin. That is the digitized copy of it. But don't worry if you can't read that. we will see the translation of it in a minute. Okay. I have taken the initiative to have the document translated from Latin to Italian, English, Kiswahili of East Africa, Kimbundu from Angola, as well as Guarani Mbua, a native language of Brazil. And there are many other languages you will see there in a minute. I will now briefly outline the sequences that led to the Vatican verdict. My knowledge of these sequences was acquired from the translation into English of other documents that are found in the Holy Office. Mendonça's brief or memorial was presented and read on the 6th of March, 1684, as we have heard, to the Sacred Congregation of the Propaganda Fide, a sacred court in itself, which reached a verdict on the case, articulated in mandatory language. The verdict unequivocally condemns slavery. Propaganda Fide, on the 12th of March, 1685, transmitted a text of the verdict to the Secretary of the Holy Office, Monsignor Giulio Piazza, who briefed the Holy Father. Monsignor Giulio Piazza transformed the verdict into question. Mendonça then presented the case to Pope Innocent XI. Thereafter, the Pope convened a legal team, a particular congregation comprised of theologians, legal experts, eminent cardinals, and lords who delivered the verdict on behalf of Pope Innocent XI in Latin. This verdict became law on the 20th of March, 1686. In the interest of time, which I think possibly I have eaten most of my time, I will only now summarize 5 of the 11 questions and an answer. So we will look at question 1, question 2, question 5, and question 6. But let me read a couple of other things here before we go to that. This was the first time that the Vatican condemned slavery in language that explicitly stated it was unlawful to capture African unlawful to buy and sell them, unlawful to injure or kill them, and that their masters were obliged to manumit them or to set them free, and to compensate them for damages. The answer to question 3 and 4, that we will see in a minute, are those that perhaps might suggest that those who were captured justly could be sold into slavery. This refers to doctrine of just war that existed at the time. By this doctrine, a state that engaged in a just war could enslave those it captured. The best example of just war was a war that was waged in self-defense. However, the conditions for just war were very strict, and my research shows that there were not many cases in which Africans were justly enslaved. This is borne out of a statement of one of the judges, Antonio Becerra Fajardo, a judge from Madrid who was sent by Madrid Crown in 1623 to investigate the behavior of the Portuguese governors in Angola. Fajardo explained that the bulk of the war captives in West Central Africa were not captives of just war. Rather, they were captive on just war. See page 105 if you want to see more detail of that, of my book, but I know that perhaps you may not have time for that. So let's now look at the verdict. The first verdict, if you want to read it, it is there in French, it is in Dutch, it's in Italian. Sorry. The verdict is there translated into various languages, because what I thought was important is that this has to be understood not only for people who had the domain of the English language, but other people from other parts of the world, but mainly European states that were part of the transatlantic slave trade. So that's what we can see there. But let's look at the question 1. Is it lawful to violently, to deceitfully capture black or heathen into slavery? Your Eminence's response was, or the response that we get from the Vatican is, it is unlawful to do it. Let's look at question 2. Is it lawful to buy, sell, and make others, I can't read that, yeah, contract. You possibly can't read that, but why didn't I, why do I not let you read it yourself? Yeah, because that might be. But then the answer, what we get, the answer from your Eminences is, it is unlawful to do it. And let's look at question 5. Perhaps you can't read it, but let me read it. Are not the buyers, are not the masters of the black, as well as other defenseless heathen, captured by violence, deceit, obliged to manumit them? Are they not to be set free? That is what the question is asking here. Your Eminency said that they are obliged to set them free. Let's look at question 6. Are not the buyers of black and other defenseless heathen who have been made slave by violence, treachery, both by buyers and their masters, bound to compensate them for damages? Your Eminences said they are obliged. Let's look at question 7. Question 7. Yeah, question 7. Is it lawful for the masters of black or other heathens I can't read that now. With the private authority to expose them to danger of death or to wound them, burn them, or kill them? Your Eminency said it is unlawful. So what we have here is a verdict that clearly gives a line of condemnation, question by question, that has been asked. Owing to ongoing issues concerning enslavement of the Africans, in 1711, 1739, 1741, 1794, 1826, the Vatican again considered all these questions and answer and reaffirmed them. So in other words, this is a sequence of events that happened until the 19th century. How do I now conclude all of these things that you have come to listen to? Based on this new evidence, I argue that Mendonça's verdict, or the Vatican verdict on Mendonça's case, was a universal condemnation of the Atlantic slave trade. Yet the Christian state of Europe failed to honor it. It is up to us to revisit it and make it clear that on the 20th of March, 1686, the Vatican declared that slavery was unlawful. Reparations are therefore due for unlawful practice of transatlantic chattel slavery. When I presented this case, the new evidence, to Cambridge University Press, they immediately asked me to write another book, which I'm considering to do so. But before that, I'm writing an article to be published in the Journal of History so that people can get this material very quickly. So this is where I'm going to finish my talk. I'm sure some of my colleagues are going to say other things, and then perhaps the question would come later.
Wonderful. Wonderful. Prof. Nafafi, thank you so much. You know, Butcher Banton has a song where he says, the fool has never been told. We could go on and on. The fool has never been told. And we're seeing a little bit more of the fuller picture of the story of abolitionism, starting way back before we as people from the colonial spaces invaded by the British understood. And so we really honor you for your work and thank you for opening our eyes even more widely about so much that we haven't known. There are some questions that flow, I think, very naturally from some of what you have said to us that we'll engage you with when we get to the conversation part, yeah? So we thank you again, Prof, and we will engage as we go along. So thank you so much. Go and invite Dr. Hebe to join us up front, and he's going to be talking to us about why the proceedings before the Vatican are part of the development of international law. So, Doc, over to you.
Thank you. Oh, is it possible that I hold it? Yeah. Okay, good. Good evening, everyone. It's really a great pleasure for me to be with you today for various reasons. First, thanks to Judge Robinson, who the first time he discovered that I was interested in history and these issues about slavery, took the time to listen to me, and from that moment on, didn't let me go. To the point of bringing me to Jamaica, which is a country that we hear about when we are in West Africa. And we love so much that we believe that it is a very, very big country. So when I landed after all the tribulations with respect to my visa, my first question, I believe, was, how big is Jamaica? And I was told that it was just 4,000 square miles, if I remember correctly. No, I'm extremely grateful to be here. I'm extremely grateful to the Jamaican Council of Churches for making space for this kind of discussions, which allow us to go back to history, to reconsider facts, challenge assumptions, and look forward to what we are going to do with the knowledge that we have acquired. Thank you very much, Tracy. Thank you, everyone, for coming. My point today is to support the argument that was made by my brother. I have to say that our research do not follow the same line. I was interested in territory. I was interested in how Europeans acquired sovereignty over non-European territory. That was my focus. So I started by looking at how they viewed the rest of the world from the 15th century until the end of the 19th century. Since slavery was not my focus, I had found some materials would allow me to have a sense of what was the legal framework applicable, but I hadn't found in my own research anything specific about slavery. So when I got to learn about Mendonça and your work, I was extremely delighted, because what he found can be proven by just understanding the history of colonial expansion and the history of the interaction between Christian sovereigns and the rest of the world. So that is really what I'm going to prove today by looking at the various elements of the case. Let me start with a question. I am from Burkina Faso. I arrived in Jamaica, and I'm very happy to be here. I decide to go to the Supreme Court because I'm also a lawyer. And I go to the Supreme Court, and I tell the Supreme Court I have a grievance against a Dutch person for a contract that has been concluded in Ivory Coast, and I intend the Supreme Court to hear my case by applying to it Burkina Faso law. What? That's exactly the first question. What are you talking about? I promise you that if I was to do that, the security guard at the Supreme Court will call Judge Robinson and tell him, come and pick up your guy. He might be perhaps sick, because the Supreme Court does not have jurisdiction. Mamadou does not have standing. The law that he is claiming as applicable is irrelevant here. And actually, we really don't know whether he has a sound mind. Perhaps you should check. But you see, when Mendonça is presenting his case, no one is claiming that what he is presenting is irrational. No one is saying that, actually, are you okay? Do you need help? No one is saying that he has to go before another tribunal. All the actors are assuming first that he has the right to bring such a case, that the Vatican has the competence, the jurisdiction to hear that case, that the legal arguments that he was making and the sources of law that he was mobilizing were okay, that the remedies that he was seeking were remedies that could be granted by the Vatican. No one was considering the case to be so far-fetched just to close it before even opening, before even listening to him. And I believe that this is a very important element. The reason why no one thought that the case was patently unmeritorious is, in my view, because of the fact that they were used to such cases. Let's start with first Mendonça asking to be heard, is standing to bring the case. Actually, this is something very common in the history of European interaction with the rest of the world. It was common for European sovereigns to write to the Pope to ask the Pope to be enlightened with respect to some of their engagement with the non-European people. I will just take one example. In 1436, Portugal, today I will focus primarily on Portuguese practice because it goes along with what you just said. Portugal decides to conquer Tangier. And Tangier is in the northern part of Africa. That was the beginning of Henry the Navigator's conquest. They ask, is it lawful? Are we allowed to conquer Tangier? So they request an opinion from the Pope as to the lawfulness of conquering Tangier. I need to read a little bit what was said there because I will be mobilizing it later. The Pope answers in 1436 read as follows. It's a little bit long, so bear with me, but I will be cutting. According to the books of the holy canons which govern the holy apostolic faith, if the request of King Duarte deals with the infidels that occupy territories which belong to Christian, weaken the Christian religion, transform holy churches in damned mosques, and commit several other abominations, war can and must obviously be waged against them with the authority of the Pope. 1436. But however, if the request concerned the infidels who occupy territories which have never belonged to Christians, one should distinguish whether these infidels have caused injury to Christians or not. If they do so, it is lawful to wage war against them. Otherwise, the king is not entitled, without any further, to wage war against them because, and here I will check who is coming regularly in church or not, because the earth and its fullness belong to the Lord, who makes the sun shine on both good and bad people and feeds the birds in the sky. And the saying continues. There are various elements here in the statement, but I want to flag to you first the sources that are being mobilized. Being mobilized are the fact that Jerusalem had been conquered, and for that there is a ground cause to wage war. But except for that, you needed a just cause of war. Why? Because the infidels, despite the fact that they are not Christian, they are still, God is making his light shine upon them like all of us. So upon which title can we go in order to wage war against them? You see a biblical source being mobilized in order to deal with a temporal matter. Should we wage war? Is it lawful for us to wage war against the people from Tangier? The Pope. Why was the Pope considering itself to be entitled to do so? The Pope was feeling entitled to do so on 3 grounds. First, popes had been at the origins of Portuguese expansion. I already mentioned 1436. I could mention 1436 for the Canary, 1452, 1455, 1497, 1502. The Pope have been at every step of Portuguese expansion, granting them papal bulls of crusades, including by assimilating black Africans to the Saracen, meaning the Arabs who were occupying Jerusalem at that time. Secondly, even if reform had already been happening, the Pope had still maintained not only its spiritual authority, but also its temporal authority with respect to Christians. And King Duarte, the King of Portugal, is a Christian. So if there is a case brought against him for mistreating other Christians, the Pope has the right, the Vatican has the standing to pronounce itself on it. Thirdly, as I said, and you may have noticed it in the answers that the verdict that Jose just read, actually many Indians, many of the people who were being enslaved had converted to Christianism. And at that time, the rule was that slavery cannot be imposed upon Christians. So it was counterintuitive to be imposing slavery on entities that had recognized the Pope, were in treaties with Portugal, and so forth. I want here to introduce the papal bulls of 1493, the one which was given to Spain. That one is slightly different. It is slightly different because it is based upon the view, the report that Christopher Columbus made upon his first trip in this area. Christopher Columbus said to the Pope that the entities that he encountered were not similar to the Great Khan. The Great Khan was a mythical figure that they expected to find somewhere around India. So he said he didn't meet the Great Khan, that the people that he met there had no kings, they did not know how to use weapons, and they were walking naked. And they had also no laws. And he suggested to the Pope that the Pope could place them under the sovereignty of a Christian prince for what he called their education and Christianization. So for those entities, the Pope felt that as the vicar of Christ, he could issue a papal bull to Spain. But even in the church doctrine, the 1493 papal bulls was a little bit controversial because it was not based on the doctrine of just war. It was not, its background could not be found in any of the practice of the court, of the church. And the origin of that doctrine is to be found in the writings of Aristotle. Because Aristotle had written Greek philosophy, he had written that actually when there are some people who deserve to be placed under the tutelage of other people in order for their development and this kind of thing. So it was actually the Greek categories that were being used in order to issue the papal bull of 1493. And as a result, in 1511, 1512, there were challenges against the validity of the bull. In 1518, there were challenges. In 1537, the Pope was tired. The Pope issued a new papal bull saying, we got it wrong. These Indians are human beings like all of us, and therefore the papal bulls that was issued were no longer valid. From that moment on, Spain started to conclude treaties with Indians in order to assert its authority, instead of just going there and claiming the Pope has given me your land. Why is this important? You see again the Pope mobilizing now not the Bible, but Greek philosophy and mythology as a source for action in the temporal field. And this brings me now to the argument that Mendonça made. Mendonça made argument based on civil law, on human law, on canon law. People will tell you, oh, but this was just religion. I guess that now you realize that this was not just religion. Because in the legal order of the time, in order to determine what was the norm of conduct, you could draw from a variety of sources that were recognized by the entire community as the sources establishing authoritative law. Definitely the Bible, certainly Greek philosophy, also history. You had a variety of sources that were being mixed in order to derive what was called as lawful answer. For instance, when Victoria, who was considered as one of the first fathers of international law, by some people, not me, in his book on the Indians, he tried to explain why he, as a priest, would have to say something on whether Spain's sovereignty over the Indians was lawful or not. He explained that this question, and I'm quoting, is not the province of lawyers alone. Because the Indians are not subjects of the Spanish crown. We are not dealing here just with civil law. These are people who are not subject to human law elaborated by Spain. And when we deal with these issues which concern people outside the Christendom, priests who were educated in law, religion, and philosophy were those who were the most apt to find what was the most legal way to act. Even Grotius, who was writing in the 17th century, so more or less the same period as when the case is submitted. Grotius had to discuss whether Indians in the Americas were obliged to give to the Spaniards a right of passage through their territory. So innocent passage. We just want to go through your territory to do our things. Do you know what was the source of law that Grotius used? Grotius used the Bible. He says that when the Hebrew left Egypt, they go to a territory that they want to cross. I hope it's the Midianite, but my memory may not serving me well here. And when the Midianites refused, then they were allowed to fight. This is what is in the Father of International Law book with respect to international law. So what I'm saying there is that actually the sources of law that were being used, even if they don't look common to us nowadays, they were the sources of law that were used at that time. And therefore, Mendonça knew what he was doing by relying upon it in order to make its case. When you look at the 11 answers, you will notice that all the 11 answers focus on one main ground. Were these slaves captured during a just war? Because if they were not captured during a just war, then they had to be freed. This also was not new. In 1568, King Henry from Portugal had difficulties with another king in the African region, the king of Monomotapa. He is supposed to be in the area which is now called the Congo area. He was there. And he wanted to know what are the conditions in order to wage war against the king of Monomotapa. He didn't ask the Pope. He asked people who were called letrados. Letrados, en français, lettré, and in English, what would you be, letrados? Erudite, learned people. And the letrados, who we can't claim they were purely using the Bible or anything, came out with exactly the same statement of law that was done by the Pope to King Duarte. I have the citation, but I guess that I'm running slightly out of time, so I will not read it to you, so I can just skip it. Now let's go to my last point about the remedies. Whether the remedies that were sought by Mendonça were remedies that were known to the people at that time. And they were. They were, because of the fact that the papal bull etc. Inter Caetera of 1493 was not based on any Christian church doctrine. It was always controversial. It was always controversial. And when, at the end, the Pope decided, look, this doctrine cannot be the legal basis for Spain's presence in Latin America, and decided, therefore, to issue another papal bull, I think, Pastorale Officium. The consequence was that Spain had to leave Latin America. So they organized what is known as the controversy of Valladolid, where you had Las Casas on the one hand, Sepulveda on the other hand, fighting each other as to whether the legal authority of Spain in Latin America had been well established. It was obvious that it hadn't been. You couldn't find any legal basis to enslave people, to put them in encomiendas, and it just didn't exist. Victoria, that father that I was talking about, claims that Charles V, Charles Quint, was ready to abandon the Latin America. But it was Victoria and the priests who dissuaded him from doing so. And their argument was the following. Some of these people have accepted to convert to Christianity. Are we going to leave them now? And they felt that the Pope had now a duty to administer those who were remaining. But even there, what you see is that Spain started issuing a new legislation which was no longer based on the fact that it had title over Latin America, but on the fact that it needed to conclude agreements with the Indians in order to establish its treaty. So when you think about Spain's legal basis over Mexico, they always refer to a treaty with Moctezuma. And Moctezuma is alleged to have concluded an agreement with Spain, but no one is referring anymore to the Papal Bull. So this brings me to my conclusion. All elements of the case, the standing of Mendonça to request legal advice from a ruling from the court, from the Vatican, was part of a long practice of requesting such a ruling. The Pope's authority to pronounce itself on those issues was part of a long pattern or long practice of doing so. The sources of law that were being mobilized, they were not unique to this case. They had been used from the 15th century, the 16th century, until the 17th century. The remedies that were sought were well known and were also considered as the one that should be applied when we come to deal with those issues. Consequently, and this is really, in my view, where I learned, because there is a discrepancy between what you find in historical document and the practice that followed. And that discrepancy needs to be explained. The explanation is not to say that slavery was lawful. Jose showed that there are various historical documents that show that, okay, slavery was not considered as lawful, even during that time. And even if per hypothesis one could agree that, okay, they agreed on the doctrine of just war, the person would need to prove that in each and every war where slaves were captured, it was due to the fact that the Christian had been attacked first by the Africans. And that can just not be the case. When you look at chattel slavery, the number of people who are being taken regularly over centuries, you cannot say that, oh, it was the Africans who were fighting the Christian. There is really something essential here that we need to take into account, is that it wasn't lawful. It wasn't based on international law, did not grant them the authority to do so. Actually, the law that existed at the time prohibited and allowed it only under the just war doctrine. But what was driving people was greed. They had found ways to make money, and they were not going to listen to anyone. Today, when we are discussing this issue about reparation, there are various questions that we can ask. First one, we can say, since law was not respected, therefore there was a breach of international law, and therefore reparation is owed. Right? That is one route, the straightforward. There is also another route. Even if we were to assume that these people did not know, still remain the point that they got rich at the expense of the suffering of others. And that already is enough to claim reparation. So that's what I had to say. Thank you very much for having me. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Dr. Habe. I apologize for stopping him. We had no choice. You learned a new word tonight, letrado, erudite, wise, with such knowledge about the law and the legalities and sources. We've learned a lot, and there's a lot that we can dig into, because that whole question of the discrepancy, and Prof. Nafafe did bring that up, and that was a huge sort of question hanging over his presentation. So how come it didn't end How come? How come? We have to come back to it, right? Brilliant. Thank you so much. I now invite Deacon Peter Spute from St. Michael's College and the Roman Catholic Archdiocese. We're not putting him on the spot. He can't speak for the entire Roman Catholic Church. He can't speak for what happened them times and why, but he will certainly have a response that will give some insights into what could have been happening at the time. Peter. 10 minutes. 10 minutes.
I'm going to stick to time just like the other speakers did. How come it didn't end? I'm supposed to give commentary. I prepared something, but the commentary I want to give is not that I prepared, because I didn't know what the speakers were going to say. Maybe to start with a modern case. In 1891, Pope Leo XIII, after whom our current Pope names himself, came out with an encyclical called Rerum Novarum, which in Latin means new things. And in that encyclical, he condemns as immoral capitalism and communism. They're still both going on. Why? You see, the Pope can condemn anything, but the question is who is going to listen and who is going to follow up. And what we are seeing here is that the Pope condemns slavery, but he's ignored. That's the truth of it. In studying Jamaican history in that Spanish period, which I've done, we realize that we say the Spaniards, as if the Spaniards are a homogeneous group. They're not. You have some Spaniards who came as contadores, as civil servants, as agents of the crown. And they had to follow the instructions that came from Madrid, from the king. And then you had, of course, the officials of the church who followed the church regulations. And then you had another set of people called the conquistadores. And they came to make money. And they did what they had to do, never mind what the contadores said or what the church said. And so trying to understand why the Pope could condemn slavery and it continued, I think we have to bear this in mind, that whatever authority the Pope had was a moral authority which people felt quite at liberty to ignore. On the 13th of January 1435, Pope Eugene was asked a question. The natives of the Canary Islands, are we allowed to enslave them? 1435. You need to just check that date. That's, of course, before Columbus. So we're not talking about New World business. We're talking about the Portuguese having so-called discovered the Canary Islands. They had gone there, they had formed a colony, there was a bishop, there was a church, a Catholic church. Are we allowed to enslave the local Canary Islanders? And Pope Eugene issued on the 13th of January 1435 a papal bull called Sicut Dudum, which forbade the enslavement of local natives. Why? You heard the argument, because some of them had converted to Christianity and others were about to. Therefore, you can't enslave them. But you can have them as indentured servants, because in Europe, you have serfs who relate to the manor in feudalism, and the serfs are in a sort of indentured servitude to the lord of the manor. And so we're going to treat the Canary Islanders in the same way as in Europe we treat the rural people, as you have the lords and the serfs. And the peasant in Europe had a duty to his liege lord under feudalism, and therefore in the Canary Islands, the Canary Islanders would be serfs with some duty of labor to their liege lord. So they are taking European feudalism and transferring it to the Canary Islands. But that sicut dudum did not forbid the enslavements of non-Christians. That only applied to Christians. For the same argument that was given, once the person becomes Christian, Catholic, then you can't enslave them because they are now in the freedom of Christ. Ethical lapse. Why can you enslave non-Christians, but you can't enslave Christians? That was an ethical lapse, but the logic is there for you to see. I certainly don't accept the logic, but there was a logic behind it. Because from the days of Roman law, from Aristotle, Greek and Rome, not just Greece, you had just slavery and unjust slavery as a philosophical concept. And there were 4 grounds or title for enslavement, just enslavement. Capture in a just war, and the last speaker spoke about just war extensively. If the war was a just war, then a prisoner of war was, you were allowed to enslave them. Or a person could receive a sentence as a punishment for a crime, and the sentence would be enslavement. They could go to prison and broke rock stone. I wonder if there's any country that does that still. The people would have said that's a form of enslavement as a punishment in a court of law. Or if you were in debt, you could be sent to a debtor's prison. You would have to be enslaved to work off your debt. And fourthly, you could sell yourself into slavery or sell your children into slavery to obtain money. We're not talking about black people here now. We're talking about white people. We're talking about Europe. We're talking about how European white people dealt with slavery. Slavery was in Europe before it came to the Caribbean. And so if there was just title, then the enslavement was just. But if someone was kidnapped for profit, then the enslavement was unjust. And the canon lawyers, the church lawyers, some of them were named earlier, said the type of enslavement that is going on in the Caribbean is clearly unjust because people are being kidnapped, people are being captured. There are slave raids into Africa to capture slaves. This is not just according to the canons of the church, according to Roman law. You cannot just kidnap people like that and make them slaves. And therefore, all the slaves in the Caribbean and the New World should be freed immediately. That was the church rule. Of course, it was ignored. Then Ottoman Sultan Mehmed II threatened to invade Catholic Europe. And on the 18th of June, 1452, Pope Nicholas V issued another papal bull called Dom Diversas, which said, and I can't read it because Anna is going to say I'm out of time, but basically, since they are going to invade Europe, we can invade them. Capture them, search them, subjugate them, the Saracens and the pagans, any other unbelievers, and we can reduce them into perpetual servitude. So if you're going to invade me, if you're going to invade and kill some of my people, then and make them hostage, Gaza, then I can go and kill your people and make them hostage too. I mean to say, this is quite an old concept. So Europe needed to be defended against invasion, But what this bull did was authorize Portugal to become the aggressor. And preemptive strike. If they were going to invade you, you go and invade them first and make them slaves. Again, a moral lapse. But we're trying to understand what happened in the Caribbean. So this iniquitous papal bull was used by later conquistadores in the New World to enslave the Amerindians that they found, the Tainos and others, and as justification for the encomienda and the Atlantic slave trade. This was a complete misuse of that papal bull. Queen Isabella opposed slavery. In her 1500 response to Columbus's transport of Tainos from Santo Domingo to Spain, she said, no, you cannot enslave my subjects, send them back. And of course, all of them that came in 1493, 1496, 1498, and 1499 on Columbus's ships were sent back in the ships that carried Governor Bobadilla back to Santo Domingo, and her subjects could not be enslaved. And so, again, we have to bear in mind that this is a complex situation. But since I've been given the wrap-up signal, on the 2nd of June, 1537, 488 years ago last week, Pope Paul III issued the bull Sublimis Deus, in which he forbade the enslavement of the indigenous people of the Americas and all people. Subliminus Deus went on to state that Amerindians are fully rational human beings, even if they are heathen, and denounced any idea to the contrary as directly inspired by the enemy of the human race, that is Satan. Anybody who says that the Amerindian people are not human and can't think is Satan telling them that. That's what the Pope said. Pope Paul went on to condemn slavery in the strongest terms, declaring it null and void for any people known as any other people that will be discovered in the future. And the bull states the entitlement of Amerindians to liberty and property, and said that they must be evangelized. Interesting, Sublimis Deus made no distinction between just and unjust slavery, that it condemned all slavery equally. Not everybody interpreted Sublimis Deus that way, but needless to say, Sublimis Deus was ignored by the Spanish colonists, both the public sector and the private sector, and the abuses continued. Let me skip that. And so, on 18th of April, 1591, Gregory XIV issued a bull saying that reparations are to be made by Catholics in the Philippines to the natives of the Philippines who have been forced into slavery by the Europeans. The Catholic Church ordered reparations to the Filipino people for being enslaved by the Catholics in the Philippines, and that all native slaves in the islands be set free. That encyclical was ignored.
Like he's ignoring me.
Indeed. I'm following the good example of my predecessors. And so now we come to our Prince Mendonça, who was a very brave man to initiate a legal action in the Vatican against the Kingdom of Spain, the Kingdom of Portugal, and a number of other kingdoms, saying that they had breached the law. And I was privileged to receive a copy of the 11 questions and answers. And it's quite obvious to me that those 11 questions and answers are taken straight from the papal bulls. All of the answers that Mendonça was given are straight orthodox out of either Sicut Dudum or the other encyclicals that I mentioned. There was nothing new, no new theology, no new law in the answers to those questions. To say then, and my brother Justice Robinson said it in his introduction, that what the Silva Mendonça did, the prince did of Mendonca, was to convince the Vatican that they were wrong on slavery is a bit overstated. The Vatican had long said that slavery was wrong. The problem was people were not listening to them. To say that for the first time the Catholic Church was being convinced that slavery is wrong is simply not true. It's not true. To say that Mendonça got the church for the first time to agree that slavery was wrong, it's just not true. It goes back at least 200 years before that in the encyclicals of the Pope. And I have other things to say, but I think it's wise to stop. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Deacon. So there's ethical lapses and there is ignorance and ignoring. And I'm glad that you finally decided to stop ignoring me. So we heard a challenge that Peter just put out, that for us to state that this was the first da-da-da-da was incorrect because the church already knew. So we've still gone back to that question, you know. We know the wrong, why can we not do the right? And we'll come back to that as we have our discussions. We still have two more learned presenters that we need to hear from. Prof, please, thank you for your patience. Prof. Vereen Shepherd.
What a lot of bulls we have heard about tonight. And we're still fighting for justice for people of African descent and Africans. And so I kept thinking, we can't use those bulls to fight our cause, because you're going to use the oppressors' bulls to fight our cause. But anyway, they say I'm to pass remarks, which I don't like to do, but I will pass some. But I have to express my respect to the ancestors, indigenous peoples, Africans would have walked these grounds before us. And we look about our space on their behalf. And I pay respects to all those trafficked to Jamaica starting in 1588 and a little before as well. And those ships never stopped coming until about 1822. Don't let them fool you about 1807, 1808. And the mortality rate was as high as 96% on some of those ships. But nevertheless, what an amazing discussion we have had so far. Thank you very much. I think even if we knew some of this already, the church knew it was wrong, colonizers knew it was wrong, I still think, as a historian, I like evidence, things you can pull out and talk about. And I still think reparation advocates can say they got a shot in the arm by looking at this document. And I hope to read your book. So I have a few takeaways from the discussion. The first one is that deeming trafficking and chattelization as crimes against humanity has a long genealogy. And you heard me say in the case of Jamaica, it started so long ago. The second, relatedly, advocacy around seeking redress for those crimes against humanity for Africans and people of African descent and indigenous peoples also has a long genealogy. Africans, wherever they found themselves, started the advocacy, not Europeans. And we have heard one great advocate tonight. But we also have to understand that before 1684, the trafficking was going on. You heard about the papal bull, the Treaty of Tordesillas, that divided the world between Spain and Portugal and gave them the right to do that. So even as this was happening, ships were going right across the Atlantic. So we may never know the nature of the advocacy, all the forms of advocacy. But what we know, that from the 14th, 15th, 16th century, every African trafficked, chattelized, advocated for freedom. Every one of them advocated for freedom, despite the consequences. So we, the descendants, are obliged to carry on the advocacy until those implicated live up to their responsibilities, which they knew. They knew their responsibilities. Not just to answer yes or no to the charges, but to right the wrongs of the past, following the wrongs highlighted by the complainant we have heard about tonight, but also in all the work done by all the historians that you have studied, and one is in the room, Professor Bailey. In The Empire Pays Back, that documentary by Robert Beckford, in the Brattle Report, and in all the other advocacy work that we have been doing. So I think we also have to appreciate the role of capitalism and answer your question. It's a simple answer, really, you know. Profit and power. Profit and power. Because at the same time, we can't forget who legitimized, even though we're talking about the Vatican and so on, new Pope and all that. Never forget who legitimized the Europeans' role in the trafficking of Africans. In 1452, as we have heard, Pope Nicholas IV issued the papal bull Dum Diversas, which granted Portugal the right to conquer, enslave, and convert non-Christians. And Portugal and Spain, under the same monarch until 1640, were the pioneers of the transatlantic trafficking in enslaved Africans. We don't say slave trade anymore. Indeed, even as the Pope was speaking in 1684, ships were going and coming across the Atlantic with black bodies and souls. So lucrative for Europeans was the trafficking, as Eric Williams long demonstrated. And laws had already been passed to deem them non-humans. Portugal, in fact, used the permission of the Pope to traffic around 47% of all Africans trafficked to the Americas, and did so between 1501 and 1866. And closest to them would have been the British, with 25%, France 11%, and Spain 9%. The British were the first to develop in the Caribbean the body of laws in which Africans were defined as chattel. The Barbados legislature in 1636 deemed all enslaved Africans as the property of their purchasers and heirs forever. And these were not laws that they implemented in their own country. They developed those laws specifically because they didn't think anything of us. And subsequently, of course, we know Jamaica and all the other colonies embraced and, in fact, pioneered and fixed laws as resistance continued. And, you know, before I close, I always like to quote Mary Prince, who was enslaved in Antigua, Barbuda, and Bermuda, taken to Britain, freed later on, but became an advocate for emancipation. And she said this in her autobiography: "Since I have been here," that's in England, "I have often wondered how English people can go out into the West Indies and act in such a beastly manner. But when they go to the West Indies, they forget God and all feelings of shame. I think, since they can do such things. They tie us slaves like hogs, moor them up like cattle, and they lick them so as hogs or cattle or horses never were flogged. And yet they come home and make some good people believe that enslaved people don't want out of slavery." Mary Prince. And we, of course, know the role of the church. I don't have to tell that to you tonight in this dastardly act. So, in the end, the evidence reinforces, I think, what we have always known and argued, that papal law, church law, European law could never make us believe that chattelization was legal. Never. That's why our ancestors fought so much. Also, chattel enslavement and the trafficking in Africans were always crimes against humanity. The whole thing was not just illegal, it was immoral. And defenseless people, as you have heard from those questions and answers, heathen or not, should not be enslaved. And freedom from captivity and chattel enslavement was the ideal. All had the right to be free. So as I close, I want to say we have to increase our own advocacy, use what we can from the evidence tonight and all the evidence that we have gathered and published. And I remind you of what the CARICOM Reparations Commission is demanding: a full and formal apology, an Indigenous Peoples Development Program, repatriation and resettlement, not just take people back to Africa and leave them at the airport. Restitution of cultural heritage and cultural reconnection, repair of the public health crisis, capacity building and development for education, compensation for violence against women and the family, and for the crimes against humanity, psychological rehabilitation, the right to development through technology, debt cancellation, and monetary compensation. And on behalf of the associated members who are still colonies, the end of colonialism in our region. So in the new 10-point plan, we're embracing all those new elements, and thanks to Judge Robinson and all those who sent in their comments. So these 10 points outline the path to justice, truth, restitution, compensation, and satisfaction for the victims and descendants of genocide and chattel enslavement. And we will use the evidence you have left with us, you have shared with us, and the evidence that we just heard from Peter, and all the other evidence that will be shared tonight in our fight. And I see Mr. Bartley there and other members of the Reparation Commission, and we will never stop because our ancestors never did. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Prof. Thank you very, very much. We appreciate the reminder of your introduction for us to honor the ancestors and those who walked these lands and those who suffered in these spaces so that we can be. And we thank you for always reminding us about that. And then tying in certainly to what our keynote presenters made clear to us, the use of multiple sources so that we can deepen and strengthen the fight that we're all engaged in towards reparations. Prof. Bailey, over to you.
Here. And I very much want to be very brief and keep to my time. Thank you, Professor Perkins. And also thank you to Hope United Church and the leaders of Hope United Church in hosting tonight. Also thank you to Reverend Dixon, Justice Robinson, and my fellow members of CRAF, Reverend Bruce Fletcher, Dr. Hillary Robertson Hickling, Reverend Stephen Jennings, and Reverend Stephen Cohen, Reverend Dr. Colin Cohen, and also Reverend Dr. Gordon Cohen. I just want to mention them because I am a member of CRAF, Church Reparations Action Forum, and I'll say something about that in a minute. And I am also a historian of slavery, alongside Dr. Vereen Shepherd. Very proudly, I am part of the academy that's been studying, writing, and teaching about the history of slavery and its impact for 30 years. I also am very committed to public history, and I like to think of the work that I do as bringing history to the people and trying to make it and communicate it in a way that is accessible to everyone. I try. So once again, as a member of CRAFT, I'm also representing CRAFT today and just giving some brief remarks. It's already been established that the church was, unfortunately, complicit in the history of enslavement. And we've talked a lot, obviously, about the Catholic Church, but it should be mentioned that it's not just the Catholic Church, it's the Anglicans, the Baptists, and so forth. It's all the main denominations that are historical denominations that in some way or the other were involved. And so CRAFT is very interested in seeking reparations specifically from those church bodies which were involved in enslavement in any way, and not just from the perspective of financial reparations. We are really interested in racial reconciliation and reconciliation in terms of how the church reconciles itself to its own message and witness. That's actually just as critical to us as getting financial reparations in any way to fund schools or psychological impact and environmental issues and the rest. Very similar to some of the things on the CARICOM plan, as well as the national reparations, their plans as well. So that's by introduction. Let me just say a great thank you to Dr. Nafafe and also Dr. Hebier for wonderful presentations. Obviously the book, which I have largely read, is an excellent book. And I think, why is it significant? Lots has been said here, but I'll be brief as to why I think it's significant. In teaching slavery and writing about slavery for 30 years, very often I'm asked, well, why do you want to work on an issue like this? And sometimes students may come to class thinking this is going to be depressing, it's going to be a downer, we're going to be talking about chains and whips and a lot of violence, and that's obviously very difficult to embrace and to think about for a whole semester, if sometimes a year. And I think what I like so much about this book is that it does what I've been trying to do in my work, as well as others have been trying to do in their work, to say that slavery is more than about whips and chains and violence. First of all, it's also about, as African-American poet Langston Hughes says, what happens to the dreams deferred. You know, there were hopes and dreams of every enslaved person, every person that was enslaved on the African continent, brought here and elsewhere in the so-called New World. They had hopes and dreams just as you have hopes and dreams. And so it's more than whips and chains, but also there was a legacy of resistance. And that's what this book and this work speaks to in such a powerful way, that there's been a long legacy of resistance. And as Dr. Shepherd has already said, Professor Shepherd has already said, that resistance took many, many different forms. But I want to look at kind of three historical moments briefly, and in the middle is Dr. Nafafe's work in terms of Da Silva Mendoza. But the first moment that I'm thinking of takes place in the early 16th century, and that's King Alfonso of Congo, who was one of the first people on the African continent to be converted to Christianity. And interestingly enough, I learned from your book that he was likely related to Mendonça, which is very interesting. I did not know that. But here you have this African king who, when he was converted to Christianity, he then wrote to the King of Portugal and said, please do not send traders. Send priests, send school teachers, send people who will uplift us and teach us, in effect, be missionaries. And he wrote several letters to that effect, and that happened in 1526. So that gives you an idea that Africans from very early on, as has been said, were very actively involved in trying to abolish the slave trade, even in those early years. Then in the middle, you have the 1684 case of, and these are just three moments of Mendoza, who obviously makes a very powerful makes a very powerful appeal to the Pope to end slavery and to discuss issues of repair. And then finally, I want to highlight Equiano. And I want to, For those of you who know some of this history, is very famous, otherwise known as Gustavus Vasa. For those of you who are still learning more and interested to learn more, please, it's all online, it's full text. The autobiography of Equiano, or Gustavus Vasa, is one of the first autobiographies of an formerly enslaved man. And to read that biography is just, it's so precious, because this is somebody who was enslaved as a child, brought all over the world, got his own, got himself freed by 1766, ended up in England, and has been said, and is said in your work too, became a very strong abolitionist. Why is this interesting? It's interesting because Equiano, not only being formerly enslaved, fights for the freedom of others, but he also approaches Queen Charlotte, who mysteriously, we think, may have been one of the first black or mixed race queens. And Queen Charlotte in the 1780s, fun fact, was married to King George III, and he's the one who presided over, the loss of America, or the 13 colonies in North America. So quite interestingly, that Equiano is in England, and he's presenting a petition to the Queen, who again, in modern day times, we're thinking that she might be enslaved. She might not be enslaved, she might have had some mixed heritage, which is interesting. But nonetheless, she had the title of Queen of England, and he was making a petition to her. So I say all this to say that there's all this wonderful, it just adds to the evidence of African agency, Africans actually actively involved in not only affirming and getting their own freedom, but affirming the freedom of others. And I think that is very powerful, and it speaks to what's going on in the academy. Now, you might say, is this important? It's so important because whether we realize it or not, the written word is guiding not just our past, but our present. And so, to have these people doing this in writing is, and showing their level of erudition and so forth is extremely significant. The other thing I want to add, and I think this speaks to, how am I doing? Oh boy, we're moving quickly, is the question of, did Africans sell other Africans into slavery? And this is, of course, a very burning issue on many people's minds. And the short answer is, it's complicated. But even more so than that, they were not equal partners with Europeans. And I think, again, Dr. Nafafe's work speaks to that. They were not equal partners. It also speaks to the fact that it was, as I say in my book, African Voices of the Atlantic Slave Trade, it speaks to the fact that it was a sell or be sold era. And we have to accept that that's the kind of conditions that they were under for 350 years, is sell or be sold. In many cases, there was an enormous amount of pressure for self-preservation versus the preservations of others around them. It's a more complicated issue. I hope you will go deeper into it, but I think you can be comfortable reading his work and other works, knowing that the quick answer that we are often told is, yes, they did, and they're the ones that sold us into slavery and so forth, is truly just incorrect and incomplete in many ways. Last but not least, let me just say something about repair, because this book, this work speaks to repair, and that's what we're all about. And I want to say that the repair that we're talking about is, as I've mentioned, that's where the hope and the healing come from. That's why learning and teaching about slavery and the impact on the present, to me, has not been depressing. Quite the contrary, it's been very encouraging to think about all these other advocates, whether it's Equiano or Mary Prince or Callie House from North America, who was one of the early advocates for the reparations movement, or Queen Mother Moore in the 1960s. There's so many people who have been fighting for this, and we're just the latest group, and hopefully the last. Hopefully the last to actually, we're getting closer. Make no mistake, we're getting closer. The backlash that you're seeing in the United States and in Europe is because we're getting closer. I'm reminded of the expression, the higher monkey climb, the more him expose. And I think it's because we've been climbing really high. And so it's time to knock us down. It's time to really put us fully in our place, but we will not be moved. We will not be moved, and reparations is coming. And that's exactly why there is some of this backlash. So I end here by saying part of the repair, I also think, is connecting with our African cousins, brothers and sisters, including you. Part of the repair is making concrete connections with you. So thank you to Justice Robinson and others, JCC and Kraft, for bringing you here. We have to concretize our relationships with the continent and restore that breach, as it says in the word. And I hope that all of you listening to me will think about when you are going, not if, but when you are going to visit Africa. Someplace, somehow, West and Central, we obviously suggest, because many of our roots are there, but you can also visit Ethiopia, which was never colonized. You can also visit Egypt. You can visit so many different places that will give you a sense that our history did not begin with the Atlantic slave trade or the history of enslavement. So thank you very much. It's a pleasure, and thank you, Anna, for indulging me.
Thank you, Dr. Bailey, a very excited historian who wants to bring history to the public. Eh? And we thanks for the reminder about our story not being just about the transatlantic trade and chattel slavery, but also one of resistance and the bond that exists among all of us and so on. We thank you all for continuing to remain with us. We certainly have gone over time, one, because we started a little late, but also two, one or two people did go over time. Not looking at Peter at all, but one or two people did go over time. But I know that this is the part that many of you want to be here for. And so we're going to ask you to remain and engage with any or all of our presenters. And how we'll do it, we have some roaming mics, so we'll just pass them through the audience. When you put your hand up, I'll recognize you. And then what we want to do is to ensure that as many people as possible get an opportunity to engage with our presenters. So we really just ask you to ask as brief as you can a question and ensure that you indicate to whom you're pointing your question to. And I see Hillary's hand up.
Ibrahim Traore, and I think that he represents, like one of our speakers this evening, the issue of Burkina Faso. Because if there was ever a show of reparations, it is that the people have to find ways of regaining their wealth. And so I am struck by the comment about the link between the continental African and the African abroad, and to see how that repatriation and repair can take place. And so I would love to hear some discussion about this. I do not know if the Burkina Faso person is of the similar era as the gentleman I just spoke about. My son. I don't know, but I think there's something happening which is very encouraging with this new generation. Have I asked a question? I hope so. And while they're speaking, I think a very important thing, I don't know if some of these things I'm seeing online are real or not, but he is very well informed. And part of this whole story of this generation is, how do we inform this generation of this history?
Seeing hands, all right?
I'd like to do in private, so that today we really focus on his research and the point that the facts that he is bringing to our attention. But I agree with you that the gist of the claim to reparation is to undo the evil consequences that have been caused by the wrong. How do we do it today? That is the real point. And I feel, at least, but I'm really speaking on my own here, I feel that if we were just able to create a fair and just international economic and financial system, that would contribute largely to reparation. Because the idea that we are begging for money is something I'm still uncomfortable with. What we want is that all the systems that have been based on this wrongful act are just uprooted so that we can fend for ourselves. Whatever we may say, today I personally believe that if you were to try to quantify exactly what each and every of the colonial powers have really caused, probably they will not be able to pay. But if they were to change the economic system, the financial system that they have created, which always keep us at the periphery, that already would be a huge step forward. So that is what I would, that would be my take now, yeah.
1682, Mendoza delivered a presentation that was a legal claim, as Nafafa has taught us, to the church, to the Vatican. And 340 years later, we led a international group of activists to the Vatican, and we delivered a reparations presentment. So Mendoza delivered a presentation, we delivered a presentment, and we had no knowledge of what Mendoza did. It just shows that the ancestors are moving and working through us at this particular time. That presentment laid out the crimes of the church, the continued impact of those crimes, and the reparations that are needed and are demanded. I have copies of the presentment. If anyone wants one, you can get one from me. It has been translated into Portuguese, Spanish, French, English, and Italian, because that injury has happened to all of us of African descent on the planet, and we all are struggling to get the repair that's necessary from the church as well as other actors. So thank you.
So he's okay? Any other questions or comments?
I just am very interested to know when the people were willing to pay reparations in year 2000, hardly anybody said a word. When I asked a couple of people, why is it? You said nothing. They said because we might have had to pay, because we are part, we own the banks now, and we got what the banks have. We own this now, and we are what they have. And I do not know if just before another 1,000 years come, they will pass over the money and to Jamaicans and gradually take it back in other years. You know, you can say you are running this now, and you, in another 50 years, you will not be running that. They would have taken it back. So we have to really look and see why we didn't get it in year 2000.
Thank you very much. Anne, you want to make a comment on that in light of CRAF, or you have a thought? Respond to that. I was not aware that we were supposed to get reparations in the year 2000. So there's a conversation that's going on there that might be worth responding to.
mean, in my remarks, what I was saying was really that we are getting closer to it. I mean, when you see in the United States, just as an example, presidential elections, that there's actually a question about reparations when they're interviewing these, presidential candidates. I mean, that happened over the last couple of elections, and that has never happened. It was never elevated to that level where millions of people are learning about reparations because they're being, presidential candidates are being asked about it. So I think all I can say is that there's progress. That is progress. And I think it's also progress that has been noted by those who do not want it to take place. And so that's part of why I believe there's a backlash.
Thank you, Anne. Anybody else has any questions for our key speakers before we wrap up? Because we're going to wrap up right now. Hi, Sarah, long time. You're coming to, okay, wonderful, wonderful. My professors emeriti, Prof.
Just to congratulate the two main speakers and those who have made remarks as well on their presentations and on alerting the Jamaican public to the significance of Central Africa, which includes Angola and the Congo areas. The significance of that area, as well as, of course, the West Africa, in the history of our coming to this part of the world. I just want to make a little niggling point, but I think we should state it. Somebody said that King Alfonso was the first African to be converted or to Christianity or something like that. And that couldn't stand. We have Ethiopians. I think that they have the claim to that. They turn up even in the New Testament and probably also in the Old Testament, I don't know. But Ethiopia, we must not forget that Ethiopia is part of Africa as well.
Thank you, Prof. That's a good point to be reminded by. Do anybody wants to comment on Prof? Because we have another comment/question over there. You guys good? All right.
Yes. I just want to ask how valid, if we were in making a case before international bodies for racial justice and for reparations, how valid as legal precedents are the decisions by the Vatican? How valid would they be as legal precedents?
Excellent question. Dr. Letrado, please.
Yeah.
Letrado.
Yeah, I better stand up. Yeah, the first question about Alfonso. Yeah, possibly it's not on. Yeah, the first question about Alfonso is correct, that there was an older Christianity. That Christianity was older than Christian in Europe. African Christianity is older than Christianity in Europe, we know that. But what is interesting about Alfonso was that in the modern period, he was not the first one to be converted to Christianity, by the way. There were other kings in the region of today we call Guinea-Bissau who were converted because the Portuguese were in this region in 1446. From there on, by the time they get to Angola, Congo in particular, it was 1480 something, so he was not. But what was interesting was that he was the first one in that order, leaving Ethiopia aside, to turn his kingdom into Christian kingdom. That is what the distinction was about. The other question, I would leave the lawyer to answer that question, what might be the precedent in terms of legal proceeding.
So thank you very much for this question as to whether the ruling of the Vatican could be considered as a legal precedent in a pending case today. I think the first point that I would like to say is that in international law, there is no doctrine of precedence because we don't have an organized judicial system. Every tribunal is established under a specific basis, and each tribunal has the right to decide the case on its own merit based on its own case law. Nevertheless, in order to make such a decision, the ruling of the Vatican will be highly persuasive. First, it will call the judges not to buy quickly the idea that actually slavery was lawful, or that is all something that you cannot say anymore when you have read this ruling. You will need to investigate a little bit further. And as you decide that you want to investigate a little bit further, you will need to gather more evidence. And in such a scenario, at least you will always remember that there was one major actor at that time which considered that slavery was unlawful. And therefore, this will form part of the elements that you will use in order to try to establish what was the legal consensus about the lawfulness of slavery at that time. So that would be my answer. Yeah. Thank you.
When you say convert to Christianity, what do you mean? When you say convert to Christianity, what do you mean?
What do you mean when you say that they converted to Christianity?
The kings. Oh, okay. Yeah. Converted to Christianity meant they were baptized. They accepted the Christian.
No, the Roman Catholic.
Yeah.
That's not Christianity.
Right.
You mean say you bow to Rome when you baptize and convert to Christianity? Bow to Rome to save your skin.
Yes.
Like how the Pharisee and the Sadducee. Rome invaded Palestine 63 years before Jesus was born, you know that? And the Pharisee and the Sadducee and the king of Israel, Herod, all of them bowed to Rome to save them position, like what most educated people do. The Pharisee and the Sadducee bowed to Rome, you know?
Yeah.
When Rome invaded Palestine. The king of Israel, Herod, and his family also bowed to Rome. Not so, Bruce? Yes or no?
You're not going to take issue with that. Thank you so much, though.
No, I don't thank you. Hold on, man. I'm talking. A man tell me to behave myself, and you know, I have to behave myself. When you get baptized and you convert to the Roman Catholic Church, that is not Christianity. And when Rome invaded Palestine 63 years before Jesus was born, and the Pharisee and the Sadducee link up with Rome, and the king of Herod and his wife link with Rome, then become Roman. It's the same way that when you bow to Rome and baptize and become Christian, that's not Christianity.
Right.
And most of them church around here is not Christianity. Jesus was...
Thank you so much. Thank you. That's a whole other question. We're thanking you for your time. We're thanking you for your patience. Justice has allowed us to take his time for the conversation, and we're going to close out with a vote of thanks from Reverend Dixon. But I just want to ask Prof if he has any closing words, and Mamadou if you have any closing words. Really quick.
Yeah. I would like to answer to the Dean question. I think he made a remark that is needed for me to respond to. That, you know, Mendonça went to the Vatican to convince the Pope. That is precisely what the documents are saying. the Nucio's letter from the Lisbon, which Mendonça took, it says there were many attempts, but all of them failed. So Mendonça went to the Vatican, the letter says, to convey the truth. So clearly, there might have been many other cases, but what we found in this document, read the themes that are engaged in there, is clearly about African. I have not seen any bulls. From what you are saying, 1537 is the bull about the indigenous people of America, not about Africans. That might be made very clear, unless we are reading something that isn't. We read the document for what it is. It was about indigenous America, not about the African. At that time, very few Africans were brought to the Americas in 1537. Very few. So clearly it was about indigenous America. The other thing about the question about the Pope, if I can see it here, about the proposition not being something new. I think that is a statement also worth answering. The proposition as we have them in Latin, the original of those propositions were not written in Latin. They were written in Italian. That is a document I found new now in the Vatican in the Propaganda Fide. So when they get to the office of the Pope, they were translated into Latin. So what I'm trying to say, if there were other precedent earlier, this valid document already, there wouldn't have been a need to translate this proposition into Latin. They would have copied what was originally. So I would want to see if you could provide evidence of any other proposition that came earlier, before 1686. I would love to see it. Yeah, I would love to see it. The other thing, the idea of convincing the Pope was also what the priests were talking about. We have the writing of Moirans, we have the writing of Jacques at the time. What they were saying was that the Pope is complicit. Why? Because the kings of Iberia were Roman Catholic kings. They were responsible to the Pope as their captains in the Atlantic were responsible to them. So there were this chain of responsibility. So this is why what was happening to the Atlantic at that time could not have been seen as something that the Pope didn't know. So for that, this idea of convincing, to me, it would seem the correct language that Mendonça went to the Vatican, because we are talking about Africans here. Prior to that, there was no bull. But the other emphasis too, I think we must also think about. We talked a lot about the rules of the enslavement, but these rules were made in Europe, not in Africa. They were made in Europe. Why did Mendonça go to the Vatican? He could have gone to Congo. He could have gone somewhere else. But it's because of the bulls that were passed on by the Pope. For that reason, it was necessary. Africans have their rules of how they capture people and what they do with them. That is what we have not discussed. We have been discussing the rules, which, from what the kings were saying at this time, in the Congo in particular, Alvaro II, he said, our forefathers would be shocked to see what has happened to us. What used to be the trading currency, shell, fibers, were no longer currency. It became human beings that are the currency. So this is what the slave trade in the Atlantic, chattel slavery, introduced into African system. Trading in human beings become a pattern which is completely new from what African would have done. That is what we have found. So, I don't know whether Mama, you wanted to add to that.
I think To conclude, I really won't say anything substantive, but I will really encourage us as Africans to really engage with history. Not history in books, but history in the archives. Because each time we focus on histories in books, the large majority of this history we did not write. And those who wrote them also did not go to the archives. So even if they are acting in good faith, they tend to be ill-informed. So what I'm really encouraging us to do, it is really engage seriously with history. I am a lawyer, but I am encouraging a serious engagement with history. If we want to deal with issues such as colonialism, slavery, and all the other historical crimes. And of course, thank you very much for your attention. Thank you very much for having us. It was a great pleasure.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So we'll have the vote of that.
Sisters and brothers, you can start packing your bags, because by the time you're finished, I'll be finished as well. A vote of thanks is a vote of thanks is usually a formal way of closing a meeting, but for us tonight, it's really an effort to sincerely put on record our gratitude for the contributions of some very important persons. And it will turn out that all of you are. We really want to say thank you to Doctors Nafafe and Hebe for accepting the buying into the dream of Justice Robinson and considering quite sane. And if he wasn't sane, then it means you're not sane either. But we are sure he is, for buying into that dream to come to Jamaica to speak to us about an issue or issues that are of critical importance to our own understanding of how we know ourselves, our history, and where we are going. Please put your hands together for our brothers from West Africa. Good segue for us to say a big thank you to Justice Robinson. He is a hard taskmaster. I can't say it now, because everything done. But I appreciate his astuteness and his attentiveness and his commitment. And for all that you have done to make this happen, we are deeply grateful. Let's give Justice a big hand. Kraft stood beside us, walked with us, talked with us. We had several meetings, 4 or 5 of which were not necessary. But we've made sure that we dotted all the I's, crossed all the T's. And so we ended up having what was a tremendous mental, intellectual, and spiritual engagement. Please give Kraft a big hand as well. Hope United is probably now to be known as the Liberation Church. Well, we can add the Academic Liberation Church that opened its doors and welcomed us to make sure that we had a good space, good technology, good resources, good facilities, and warmth that was more than just physical, but psychological and otherwise. Let's give Hope a lot of gratitude. Thank you, Peter, for your usual stridency and astuteness and your acumen. Thank you. You are a Jamaican at heart and in practice and in every way. Let's give Peter a hand, please. And the JCC, in the person of the Bishop, who watches over all of us like a great mother. Thank you very much, Bishop, and for all that you do. Dr. Bailey, we have been impressed by your work and your presentation tonight. One big takeaway I'm leaving with is the idea that hope is not and never lost despite the pain of the past. Thank you very much, Dr. Bailey. And to the rest of us for staying But before we leave, Professor Anna, who is looking at me with her side eye, thank you very much, Prof, for navigating the spaces, even the last very difficult bump. But for taking us through this process with grace and aplomb. Thank you very much. Let's give Prof a big hand. Now, if I leave out anybody, who? Professor Vereen, she had to leave. Well, who doesn't know how brilliant Prof. Shepherd is? And every time she speaks, she adds another dimension to that brilliance. In her absence, we acknowledge her contribution, and we can, for the record, give her an applause, please. Who am I leaving? The people online? All of the guests online, I don't know how many of them, but we will hear later on. Thank you very much for joining us. It was our pleasure and honor. And now I can say, everybody else, thank you very much. God bless you. I'm going to, since I'm standing, let me just use the church language and say, the Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make his face to shine upon you and be gracious to you. May the Lord lift the light of God's countenance upon you and give you peace. And the church says, have a blessed night, everyone. Markel, we didn't forget you.